I'm Troy Cross. I've been at Reed maybe 10 years now. I teach in Philosophy and Humanities. And I guess the purpose of this session is just to introduce you to our department, answer your questions about the major, about the faculty, about the kind of philosophy we do. I think of philosophy as something like a science startup. Wittgenstein says that philosophy begins with the statement, "I've lost my way." And Aristotle says that philosophy begins in wonder. Plato says it begins in wonder. And so I think of philosophy as asking questions for which we don't really have a scientific means yet of resolving those questions.
So Troy talked about how philosophy might relate to the sciences. Why not? Because he's laid it out for me. I might say a little bit about something that I'm going to teach this year that thinks a little bit about how philosophy might relate to other humanities, and in particular to creative writing, which is just yet another thing. So this coming year, I'm going to be teaching a new course that I just dreamed up this semester, and it's called The Philosophy of Memoir. And it's basically, we're going to read memoir alongside philosophical texts that are written in kind of philosophy journals, and to explore questions about personal identity, the nature of the self, mind, memory, truth, justice, imagination. So that's just me saying a little bit about how I think philosophy might relate to literature or to other fields in the humanities. And we could ask the same kinds of questions too about history and the narrative arcs of history and how they relate to truth. Anyway, this was a little jazz session, and that's what I have.
I'm going to be teaching a class on the philosophy of religion next year. Looks at all the kind of classical arguments for and against God's existence. It's called a class in the philosophy of religion, but really it's an examination of these classical arguments, and so it's sort of more like metaphysics. The class ends up being a lot about infinity, since so many of these arguments hinge on the nature of infinity. I'm teaching a class on color, what color is. I'm also doing an introduction to the theory of knowledge, where we look at classical skeptical arguments that we don't know much of anything. We also take up the question of what knowledge is. It's really like, what is knowledge and how much of it do we have? And finally, I'm doing a class in metaphysics, I believe, which is what's the nature of ultimate reality. But in that class, we'll take up the nature of time travel.
Next year, the course I'm going to teach, it's another new course. Everything's new. And it's on the ethics of aging. And we're asking questions about what it means to be a person, to have a life, to have a good life. What's it part to be? What is it to be part of a just society? And how should society's resources be distributed justly? Those are a little sampling of what we teach, but we should probably say what our colleagues also teach. We have Paul Hovda in our department, teaches frequently on logic and teaches classes that overlap with mathematics. He teaches several classes like that. He also teaches some ancient Stoicism or some modern history of modern philosophy courses. And maybe Troy can fill us in on a couple more of our colleagues.
Mark Bedeau does philosophy of science. He does philosophy of biology, I would say. That's his main area, and philosophy of computation. He also teaches a history of modern social thought. And Mark Hinchliffe teaches kind of what I teach, metaphysics and epistemology, theory of reality and theory of knowledge, as well as philosophy of language and logic. We have a ton of logic offerings next year. If any of you want to get into logic, it's always like a crowded class. It's hard to get into. It's not going to be hard to get into next year. 3 different people teaching logic, and one of them is teaching a class with 75 seats. You don't have to take logic to take other classes in philosophy, but it is a great course, and it is very useful for upper levels of philosophy. And neither Meg nor I are teaching it, but basically everyone else who's teaching next year is teaching it. We do have opportunities to teach advanced logic classes. Those are taught by Paul Hovda, who is fantastic. And the kinds of upper level logic classes he teaches, it varies. He usually teaches a class on modal logic. That's the logic of what must be and what might be, or what would be if, the logic of ifs and buts. You can take a meta logic up through Gödel here at Reed, but that was unheard of where I went to school, and it's unheard of most places.
Question about senior theses. Just if there were any topics that come to mind on theses that you've advised students on, and just anything you'd like to share on that would be helpful.
Here's an example of somebody that did something a little bit out of the box within ancient philosophy. They asked, is tolerance a virtue? Or would tolerance be considered, is it a virtue on Aristotle's account? In any way, what is tolerance exactly? And is it a good thing? I've also had people write on John Rawls. I've had people write on Kant. I've had people write on some environmental ethics topics. The great thing about working on a thesis is, in our department, it's not like you sign on to one of our projects. You really do come up with something that you're interested in and that you want to pursue. And you essentially create your own class for a year. I mean, that's one way to think about it. It's like, I want to study this thing. And, all of us help you put together a little syllabus. And then you're essentially writing papers for yourself. And by the end of the year, you are, you're teaching us and teaching yourself in becoming a better and better editor of your own work, and a better and better judge of your own work. So by the end of the day, you've been a student in this senior thesis that ultimately you've crafted, executed, and, as it were, graded or, edited your very own class. And so that's one way of thinking about it.
We meet with students one-on-one for a good amount of time, weekly, for an entire year. And like Meg said, it's not just that we hand you a project to do. We work with you to find a project that is doable in a senior year. And the goal is really to make a contribution to scholarship, which is very ambitious, but it's also something that we try to train you in the previous 3 years to be able to do. So we have a junior seminar in which you write a 5,000 word essay, and you write that in stages. And that trains you up so you can write a senior thesis, which is 10,000 words when you're a senior. And there's a tremendous feeling of accomplishment and depth of understanding in the senior thesis orals, which is a 90-minute session with 4 of us and 1 of you, where you're defending your thesis, which we have read. That's a wonderful capstone experience for your time at Reed. Your thesis goes in the library, and it's truly special.
Was curious about some of the kind of interdisciplinary options with philosophy, like mathematics philosophy, or just some of those kind of ad hoc options.
Yeah, I've been on some theses that are interdisciplinary. Biophilosophy, because I mentioned Marc Bedeau is a philosopher of biology. He's done quite a few biophilosophy. Math philosophy, I've been on a lot of those orals. We have quite a few people who fall into that spot. What else? Theater philosophy has been done. The thing with Reed is, I just talked about the senior thesis and how it's so great, but it involves a lot of training in philosophy, right? You need a lot of serious training in philosophy to be able to write a decent 10,000 word philosophy essay that makes an original contribution to scholarship. That's not easy. And so if you're doing an interdisciplinary major, it's hard to get well-trained as a philosopher and well-trained in another field. And that's why we don't just have it as a standing interdisciplinary major. Basically, the very thing that makes Reed so strong, that is, you're writing a senior thesis and we really train you up to be an expert. also makes it hard to just take an incredible breadth of classes, right? You get depth and you sacrifice a little breadth for that, typically in the philosophy major. Although we do, of course, read ad hoc interdisciplinary major proposals, and we're wide open to them. For those of you who don't know, there is this distinction between two styles of philosophy, continental and analytic. Everybody disagrees about what the distinction is. Just like I said, nobody can agree on what philosophy is. Also, no one can agree on what analytic and continental philosophy are either. And at Reed, like almost every major philosophy department in the country, the focus is on so-called analytic philosophy, and continental philosophy is more done in other humanities, but not in philosophy. Consequently, it's done by a lot of people who teach philosophy in high school, which is why people come in asking about it. You know, many of you probably have had some exposure to philosophy in like an English class in high school. That English teacher, no doubt, studied continental philosophy, and that's what you're getting.
What's different about teaching at Reed, or just anything you'd like to kind of share from that perspective?
We bring you into the process of making philosophy, doing philosophy, and inquiring together, and that's really special. And it's a little bit painful and slow and inefficient at times, but it has a much better result. The result is that you become a philosopher. You inculcate the habits of mind of a philosopher if you go through our program.